And welcome to the Power of Objects. This is the second annual Fiori Lecture on Material Culture. And I'm Catherine Algor. I'm the president here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I am so pleased to bring this program to you. I'm sort of the pre-intro. Just to say that this is a program that was inspired by and dedicated to my predecessor, Dennis Fiori, who was the president of the Historical Society from 2006 to 2017. And he presided over the Historical Society at a really pivotal moment in its evolution. And when I think about Dennis's legacy, I think of, in particular, two passions that he had. And one was outreach. He was very determined to bring our collection to as many people and as many kinds of people as possible. And under his leadership, the public programs, a program like this one tonight, and exhibitions really flourished. And his second passion came from his museum background and is actually kind of connected to the public programs and to the exhibition. He believed in the power and the historical significance of objects. Now, at the Historical Society, we have 14 million manuscript pages, and we have quite an interesting collection of objects. But really, I think under Dennis's reign, the objects really became the star. And so we're so pleased to present this lecture to you. So before we get started, my colleague Gavin has a few little things to tell you. Gavin, will you cue us in?
Thank you, Catherine. And I'd just like to say good evening and thanks to everyone for joining us on what, if you are in Massachusetts, is a very dark and stormy night. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's nice to see a large group attending this evening. And I'd just like to say, if anyone is attending a virtual MHS program for the first time, I'd like to extend a special welcome to you. The Mass Historical Society was the first historical society in America, and we've been collecting, preserving, publishing, sharing our nation's history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of manuscripts as well as material culture. Our manuscript collection is measured in the millions, with the papers of U.S. presidents, soldiers, mothers, pioneers, and everyone in between. We publish these collections, we make them available to researchers, and we host an active schedule of programs for the general public, workshops for educators, and seminars for academic audiences that explore the themes of Massachusetts and U.S. history. We are making our collections and our online programs available for free right now, but we're only able to do that thanks to the support of our members. If you're not a supporter of MHS, I hope you'll consider joining and helping us to continue to provide these programs. Tonight, we are hosting the second annual Dennis Fiori Lecture. This evening, we will hear from Professor Jennifer Van Horn. She teaches at the University of Delaware and specializes in the fields of American art and material culture. She has written on a wide range of things, including early American prosthesis, wooden legs and dentures, and women's embroidery in the American Republic. Her courses encompass 18th, 19th, and 20th century decorative arts, material culture theory and methodology, museum studies, and the production of historical memory. She is a graduate of the University of Delaware and received her MA from the Winthrop program in American material culture and her PhD from the University of Virginia. This evening, she'll be speaking about her book, The Power of Objects in 18th Century British America, which explores how elite consumers assembled objects to form a new civil society. The study looks at a wide range of materials, from engraved city views to portraits to dressing furniture, to help explain the creation of a new society on the margins of the British Empire. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our speaker this evening, Jennifer Van Horn.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the wonderful folks at the Massachusetts Historical Society, there we go, but especially Gavin and Sarah for inviting me to come. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to share some of my research with you all. So at this point, I'll do that awkward move where I go to share my screen. All right, so hopefully you are now seeing an image of the book title at the beginning. And I'm going to go ahead now and get started. So I want to begin with this canonical portrait of George Washington, painted in the last year of his presidency by the famous portraitist Gilbert Stuart. This is an image that has come to represent the birth of a new American nation. Certainly, the political and military events in which Washington played an instrumental role were critical for the birth of America: the break from Great Britain, the Revolutionary War, the formation of a government, and eventually a constitution. But in the book and in my talk today, I want to explore the vital role that material objects, things, also played in making an American nation. How did material goods enable Americans to make themselves more civil, and in the process, help to build themselves into communities and eventually a new nation? If we think about Washington, the material goods that he selected contributed to his public image as America's first president. We might think about his clothes, the broadcloth suit of American manufacture that he wore at his inauguration, eschewing the French-made silk or British fabric in favor of American-made textiles. We might think about the dentures that he donned. Washington lost or had to have pulled all of his teeth by the time he became president, and so dentures helped to restore his voice, his ability to speak clearly, and to help give him this illusion of physical vitality, as necessary for a politician then as now. We might think about the dressing table, where Washington sat each morning to be shaved, to have his hair dressed, and also presumably to don those dentures. So material goods like these played a critical role in Washington's public persona as a virtuous Republican leader. But of course, material goods, beyond those used by George Washington himself, played a role in nation building. So I want to frame our discussion today by looking at two objects. On the left, a dressing table; on the right, a wooden leg. Both of these objects produced in the 1780s and 1790s, this moment just after the United States has broken away from Great Britain, and American citizens are starting to really face the question of what will bind their citizenry together. As different as these objects are, they both address the issue of how Americans could use objects to help make citizens or better participants in Republican government. So I want to begin by looking at the dressing table. This made for New Yorker Margaret Livingston between 1795 and 1810. Almost 5.5 feet tall, it was constructed by an unidentified American cabinet maker, and it's one of the most elaborate pieces of furniture produced in early America. As we look at it, we can notice the table's gleaming mahogany surface, each drawer and door front embellished with oval inlay, and then these inlaid swags that are festooned above the central looking glass, capped with carved and gilded urns above the cabinets at both corners. Perhaps not surprisingly, this is one of the most elaborate pieces in early America, but if we open it, things get even more luxurious. We can imagine Margaret Livingston as she might have sat before this each morning. First, she could have pulled out the central drawer to reveal what was originally a water-filled basin in that central hole, now missing. She might have lifted up the wooden lids on either side of that basin to get at beautifying lotions or washes that she might have placed on her skin. She might have opened the doors on the cabinets to each side and uncovered tiny drawers previously that had been concealed to get out things like rouges or powders or pastes that she might have applied to her face, and earrings and necklaces that she would have adorned her body with. So as I look at this piece, it's really noticeable to me that none of the materials Margaret Livingston required to complete her dressing ritual were immediately visible on the table's surface. All of them had to be obtained from inside the piece of furniture itself. The expense and attention that Livingston and her family invested in her dressing equipment, and its secrecy then, I think is really noteworthy. So in the book, I asked why Livingston required such a large and heavily ornamented table. What was the purpose of having a complicated apparatus with so many unfolding parts? It's worth pointing out Margaret Livingston was certainly not alone in her purchase of an expensive and elaborate dressing table. We see a lot of dressing equipment, particularly in the second half of the 18th century, popular both in Great Britain and the American colonies and then the newly United States. So this is another example from Charleston, South Carolina. made by William Jones around 1785. Pretty comparable in splendor to the New York Livingston table. You can see this really fantastic dynamic sweep of the grain in those mahogany veneer drawer fronts, as well as the rosewood bands and fan inlays that frame each individual drawer. Here too, though, there's greater splendor inside. Once we open that top drawer, we discover it's a dressing drawer equipped with a ratcheting looking glass and 12 rosewood lidded compartments. So certainly these are kind of the end point of a trajectory of development that we see beginning earlier in the 18th century with dressing glasses like this one. Over the course of the 18th century, dressing furniture became larger, both the surface area of it, the number of drawers, as well as the size of the looking glasses. So advancing on from this point. Much dressing furniture, this example manufactured in Boston, but many dressing glasses would have been manufactured in Great Britain and sent to the American colonies. We also see American cabinet makers using British cabinet making manuals to design their own elaborate pieces of dressing furniture. So here you're seeing Thomas Sheraton's cabinet making manual on the left. It was the source for our unknown cabinet maker to craft Margaret Livingston's table, which you see on the right. I want to call your attention to the title of Sheraton's design, a ladies' cabinet dressing table. Although members of both sexes used dressing furniture, really complex dressing tables became associated in the 18th century with women. Merchants' advertisements and cabinet-making manuals, like Sheraton's, frequently identified the most heavily outfitted chests and tables as being suitable for women's use. In a similar way, cosmetics in the 18th century became gendered feminine, associated with women. While we know that members of both sexes use some types of cosmetics, hair pomade or wash balls, men might use those. But increasingly over the course of the 18th century, the act of wearing cosmetics began to mark men as effeminate. And here you see a satirical print from London, branding those men, those urban dandies who applied makeup to be ultra feminine, to be fops or macaronis, men who were like women in their attempt to be fashionable. So I want to come to this question of what women were putting in their dressing tables. What were these cosmetics that became associated with women in this period? What were cosmetics like in the 18th century? Cosmetics had a more expansive definition, I would argue. They were understood in this period as any substance, quote, made to beautify and embellish the face or preserve or improve the complexion. So that might be anything from hair pomades to lip salves. We know that women in early America were importing a lot of these cosmetics directly from manufacturers in Great Britain. They also were manufacturing some cosmetics themselves based on recipes or receipts that would have been included in housekeeping manuals as well as cosmetic manuals. And here you see two examples of those here. So while today we might see the application of cosmetics as being pretty innocuous, a means to subtly enhance natural features, cultural critics in the 18th century argued that by lathering their faces with white pomade, dusting their cheeks with rouge, rubbing red salve onto their lips, that by doing those things, women did far more than simply enhance their beauty. Rather, people in the 18th century understood them to be making new faces, literally painting, which is the popular term for cosmetic use in the period, different, quote, lips, cheeks, and eyebrows by their own industry, as one satirical commenter claimed. So what then made cosmetic face painting, a practice that we now see as fairly benign, so powerful that it was thought to be able to dramatically change bodies and amend identity? I think the answer lies with 18th century viewers' faith in the skin's ability to signal the emotional or moral state of the body it covered. Physicians and natural historians argued that the skin was a screen, or what they called a living canvas, which registered, quote, the expressions of every passion by greater or lesser suffusions of color, as Thomas Jefferson summarized in his notes on the state of Virginia. So 18th century authors argued that the awakening of what they would call base passions, things like anger or sexual arousal, that those appeared on the face as a momentary blush or flush. But if a person experienced such dangerous desires consistently, conduct manuals warned that a, quote, shameless bronze would invade each feature, reddening the skin permanently. A person's skin, therefore, to an 18th century viewer in the British Atlantic world would have testified to the state of the person's virtue. Those who were civilized, meaning that they had effectively subdued their lower emotions, had skin that was smooth, white, and polished properly rather than excessively tinged with red. Cosmetics, as we know, offered the chance for women to intervene, a chance to make their skin, make that living canvas appear different than it did in reality. So English cosmetic manuals had offered solutions to protect and to whiten the complexion since the early 18th century. And I think those recipes or those receipts had particular utility for an Anglo-American audience. We see American women in South Carolina, for instance, turning to English manufactured cosmetics that promise to prevent or to clear a sunburnt complexion, such as the, quote, cold cream for sunburning, just imported from London, that Charleston milliner Agnes Lind advertised in the South Carolina Gazette in 1766, and you see her ad here. So cold creams, in the 18th century, they would have called them cooling creams, contained ingredients thought to cool. So things like melon, bean, cucumbers, and milk. All of them were supposed to reduce heat in the face, leaving the skin cool and smooth. Cosmetic manuals and advertisements then promised that their products could counteract the visible effects of ill behavior, that they could, quote, repair the wastes of languor and brace up the skin from relaxed habits. So keeping that role of cosmetics in mind, when we return to works like the Livingston table, as a site to apply cosmetics, dressing furniture was really important then for women's crafting of their appearance and their public personas, their appearance of civility and morality. And I think the political situation in the early United States then played a role in these dressing tables' importance and success. This is a time after the Revolutionary War, during the formation of a new political republic, when government leaders preached that women needed to assume new roles as Republican wives to their citizen husbands, as Republican mothers to future male citizens. A large and expensive piece of furniture like Margaret Livingston's dressing table proclaimed her commitment to assume a position beyond the privacy of her home. And if we look to this British example, I think we get a sense of the way that dressing table could assume this kind of political function. So this is obviously a portrait of the British Queen Charlotte with her two eldest sons from 1776. But this provides insight into the toilette ritual as a means of preparing women for the public domain and their potential public role. We see Charlotte seated before a very elaborately outfitted dressing table, this really beautiful silver gilt toilette set arrayed on its surface. Her toilette complete, we see the Queen ready to dedicate herself to her position as mother and educator of the future rulers of the realm. Her dressing equipment, which is given as much space and as much technical attention by the artist as Queen Charlotte herself here, we see being key to her transformation. So that table is positioned between Charlotte and the outside world, here represented by that view out of a large window. The dressing table then is a kind of pivot point, right, between private and public. So cosmetics were helpful for women as they readied themselves for new political roles, but cosmetics also introduced the potential for deception. Fears that makeup enabled women not to improve, but simply to conceal their true selves abounded in the popular prints and satirical texts that circulated around the British Atlantic, such as this one, which is Thomas Rowlandson's 6 Stages of Mending a Face. In the print, we see an elderly woman applying a wig, false teeth, and makeup to transform herself into a young and sexually desirable beauty, which is what we see in the final image at the bottom left. We see her significantly holding up a black mask. Ostensibly, this is a powder mask, so a mask that a woman would put on after her cosmetics had already been applied, but before her hair was powdered to protect her made-up face from the hair powder that was about to be put on. But here, it's serving a more metaphorical function as a kind of symbol of duplicity, right? So holding up that black mask, comparing it to her own cosmetically enhanced and altered physical appearance. And that equation of women's cosmetic use with a kind of masquerade or lie is one that we see showing up as well in popular literature. So the most popular cosmetic manual of the 18th century, which was called Abdecker, or The Art of Preserving Beauty, published first in 1754, equated women's makeup to a kind of a mask. They described cosmetics as a, quote, covering, sheath, or veil, under which the passions might have their play without being perceived. We also see in the 18th century women's application of cosmetics being compared to counterfeiting, the counterfeiting of currency. Claims that women's painted faces were like false bills, that they were copies that bore no relation to a woman's actual emotions or true moral character. So perhaps the best example I can give you of this potent mixture of dressing furniture, women, and deception comes from this woman and some furniture surrounding her. So the famous Rudd-Perot scandal dominated newspapers in Britain and America in 1775. At the heart of the case was this woman, Margaret Rudd. She was the key character and also the key defendant. It was a counterfeiting case that culminated in 2 executions. So Rudd, her common law husband, Daniel Perot, and his twin brother, Robert, there's always a twin brother in counterfeiting cases, right? They were accused of forging bonds from a wealthy Londoner and then using them to defraud lenders out of tens of thousands of pounds. So Rudd testified against the Perots in exchange for immunity. And she initially won the support of the public thanks to her, quote, very elegant appearance at the trial. And many images of her, including this one, place great emphasis upon her clothing and her very fashionable hat, which you see here. The Perots, however, maintained that Rudd, who was a former courtesan, was the mastermind behind the counterfeiting scheme, and that she had actually duped them into passing the forgeries. The brothers testified that Rudd was, quote, the most artful of impostors who had donned a mask of faithful friendship in order to cover the most wicked and treacherous artifice. So the Rudd-Perot trial, with its interlinking counterfeiting of bonds and identities, shocked Britons and Americans alike as proof of the potentially deadly consequences of women's ability to manipulate their external appearances. It's all the more surprising then that George Hepplewhite, in his cabinet-making guide, gave his readers the pattern for a dressing table that he labeled Rudd's table, which you see here, telling his readers that it derived its name from a once popular character for whom it was invented. So this is supposedly patterned after Rudd's own dressing table, though that's unlikely. Hepplewhite touted this table as the, quote, most complete ever made, possessing every convenience which mechanism or ingenuity can supply. We can get a better sense of its appearance if we look at an example made after this design by a London cabinet maker, Thomas Scott. And here you get a great sense of the table's bifurcated design. So there's a central dressing drawer, which you see pulled out a little bit here, that once it's pulled out all the way, a looking glass will pop up. But you also see these two complete independent dressing drawers on either side, both of these with drawers and then looking glasses independently. So that bifurcated design, the fact that it's split in half with these complete and identical dressing drawers on either sides, very much to me suggests that two different people have almost performed their toilette rituals there. I get a sense of Rudd's irreconcilable personas, of victim and of villainess. That sense of discrepancy continues in the table's overall appearance. So this is it when everything's open. When everything is closed, though, it's a much more austere form, and it gives you no real indication of all of these apparatuses that slide and swing and spring from the interior. So if we look at this table, in many ways it misleads the viewer about its contents in a way that I think we could compare to Rudd in the way that her assumption of genteel behavior kept first the Perot brothers and then the public from discerning what many felt to be her real character. So Rudd's table is the most extreme example of dressing furniture's potential for deception. But I argue in the book that in colonial and early America, dressing furniture worked in a similar fashion to shield the site of the toilette from view, to conceal functional elements within, but also to camouflage the means of accessing dressing equipment. So let me give you a couple examples of what I mean. If we go back to the Jones chest, for instance, as we look at this, we get no clue of all of these the dressing drawer that is inside, right? And if we look at an example made by the same cabinet maker now in the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts collection, we would have no way to know that the dressing chest on the left has a dressing drawer and that chest of drawers on the right does not. A later group of dressing chests produced in Charleston around 1790 are even more disorienting. So these look like they have 3 drawers all the way across. And that's true for the 2/3 of it, but that top drawer is actually a dressing drawer. So it's one long drawer all the way across, but it's been disguised as 3 drawers by using this molding and then fake handles. This dressing table by an unidentified cabinet maker in Connecticut employs a similar strategy. So the way you actually get access to the dressing table interior in this case is from the top. So those 2 fold-out tops that you see on either side, those come back together. And then once you've opened it up, you can ratchet up the looking glass and you can pull off those little covers. But the way that it's designed, it looks like you gain access from the front. It looks like those are drawers that pull out. They do not. But one would-be user, I think, has been fooled enough that they got really frustrated and pulled off the handle. And you can see that the second from the top on the left, somebody's really believed that they could get into this dressing table by pulling hard on that drawer until it finally fell off. If we come back to the Livingston table, I think it bears comparison to our example from Rudd's table. It was conceived or advertised as being Rudd's table at less expense, but it too has multiple looking glasses and a multitude of dressing drawers. And we get this sense of trickery in this piece. As we look at it, we have absolutely no idea of all the components that it harbors inside. That sense of secrecy continues even inside dressing furniture, like our Jones chest. And in this case, layers of barriers prevented visual access to the toilette items held within. So the Jones chest is equipped with a writing slide, and you see that here, leather-covered surface that would have enabled the person to use it to write on top of. but it also fulfills this function of screening everything in the dressing drawer from view. So to see what's in there, first of all, you'd have to peel back or push back that writing slide. Then you'd be confronted by another block, now in the form of these wooden covers over those little containers. So to get to the dressing things, you'd have to take all of those little lids off, only to discover more lids, right? So originally, there then would have been more covered containers in the form of pomade jars or pomade pots, and you see two examples of those here. So dressing furniture not only then kept the details of a woman's toilette ritual in the strictest confidence, but it denied that the user applied cosmetics at all. It allowed women to keep the secret of their own cosmetic use, to place their dressing furniture in public spaces, confident that visitors would be unable to deduce what cosmetics women used, and then by extension, what passions they hid. So dressing furniture really closed back up to present an embellished facade, which, like a woman's painted face, would have betrayed nothing. So we have a lot of dressing furniture that survives from the 18th century. By contrast, we have very few prostheses that survive from early America. In fact, this example that you see here, the wooden leg of Gouverneur Morris, New York politician and author of the preamble of the Constitution, is the only artificial limb known to survive from early America. Gouverneur Morris, who you see here, painted by Charles Willson Peale, along with his mentor, Robert Morris, acquired his prosthesis after a really brutal carriage accident in May of 1780, necessitated amputation of his left leg below the knee. So Morris's replacement limb was made of oak by an unidentified Philadelphia craftsman. You see here it consists of a wooden rod at the bottom, which is connected to a U-shaped upper portion by a metal ring. That longer arm would have rested against the outside of Morris's hip. The shorter arm would have pressed against his inner thigh. And you can see that that shorter arm is pierced with two holes. Originally, it would have secured a strap or a buckle, which Morris would have fastened around his thigh like a belt to help keep that wooden leg tightly bound to his body. As we look at this, we can also see a piece of leather, which is tacked to the bend of the leg. And that would have kept rolls of cushioning in place, which would have helped to protect Morris's very vulnerable stump. So a singular piece, Morris's leg was bespoke, made at his request based upon his measurements. But despite its uniqueness, it was originally one of what must have been thousands of wooden legs donned in America after the Revolutionary War. So amputation was the primary medical procedure used to save soldiers whose bones had been shattered by cannon and musket balls. As I've said, most of these do not survive, but there would have originally been many, many of them. So in the period, people would have viewed those wooden legs in a couple of different ways. So one way was an association of wooden limbs with patriotic sacrifice during war. And we get a sense of that by looking at this print, a British print, showing a sailor, giving you this idea of valorization of male sacrifice through the wooden limb. Gouverneur Morris very much played on that association himself. While he served as American ambassador to France, it was during the events leading up to the French Revolution. Morris, riding in a carriage, it was accosted by a group of French patriots who thought that there was an aristocrat inside. And they yelled, they accosted the carriage. I'm not ready for the yelling yet, but we're just about there. Morris opened the door. He thrust out his wooden leg and he yelled, quote, "An aristocrat, yes, truly, who lost his leg in the cause of American liberty." at which the mob, the crowd, applauded and allowed Morris's carriage to pass. So this, of course, is not how Morris lost his leg, but was a very clever story to tell, to play on that association of limb loss and patriotism. The other association of wooden legs and of limb loss by men in this period was much different. While veterans' bodily sacrifices demonstrated their commitment to a new political nation, America's leaders worried whether men who had been dismembered by battle could ever be the virtuous citizens that they thought were required for the Republican project to succeed. They thought that citizens needed to be male, they needed to be economically independent, and they worried that people who had suffered limb loss would perhaps become beggars, similar to the amputee who you see in this print. He bending forward unsteadily on a wooden leg, proffering his hat for donation, still wearing a torn uniform. So the use of a wooden leg would help to solve some of those economic problems that might allow men to work. But elite men had an extra kind of burden in the sense of the demand on them to demonstrate their civility or their virtue. And that was something that very much in the period required two legs. The display of the male calf was a critical component of polite behavior. And we see that particularly in conduct manuals like this one. They instructed men to stand with their legs positioned slightly apart and both feet turned out so that their calves would be visible. When placed in motion for a bow or a minuet, men's legs were expected to, quote, move with attitudes easy, free, and graceful, in order to adorn the human figure with the qualities of decency. To move haltingly or with stiffness, as amputees with wooden legs unquestionably must have, was to be, quote, awkward, deformed, and consequently disagreeable. And I want to highlight those language choices because they suggest the fact that 18th century ideas about physical disability are really quite jarring and quite different from our own. To 18th century viewers in a British Atlantic context, they saw physical disabilities as outward manifestations of internal moral failures. In medical texts and politeness manuals, authors maintained that handicaps, which they referred to as, quote, defects and deformities, they thought of them as God's retribution for a person's sins or the result of sustained ill behavior. Friends and political allies argued that Gouverneur Morris's dismemberment was the result of his infamous sexual overindulgence. Morris remained a bachelor until he was 57, and John Jay repeated the story that was being circulated in Philadelphia, that Morris injured himself while fleeing from a tryst interrupted by a cuckolded husband. So to his contemporaries, Morris's disability was physical proof of his hedonism, his lack of discipline. So amputees like Morris required prostheses then not only to repair physical loss, but also to help restore their politeness or their civility. The most famous maker of prostheses, the 16th century surgeon Ambrose Paré, instructed readers that artificial limbs could do just that. He said that they were not only profitable for the necessity of the body, but also for the decency and comeliness of the body, that they could supply the defect of members that are lost. So I think we should ask how exactly a wooden leg could restore beauty to a body that was permanently marred by asymmetry. What solutions were available in the 18th century? You see one of those solutions here, actually. In Europe, silversmiths and sculptors offered wealthy amputees lifelike legs made out of gold, silver, and copper, with systems of ropes and pulleys that emulated tendons. And you see early design for one of those here in Paré's work on the right. In England, amputees also had access to lifelike wooden legs that were made by the makers of artists' lay figures. So none of those legs are known to survive. We know, thanks to his correspondence and his business records, that Josiah Wedgwood, the famous British pottery entrepreneur, had one of these legs, which he purchased from a lay figure maker. And we get a sense of what they might have looked at based on the surviving examples of lay figures, these little posable figurines used by artists in colonial America. And you're seeing an example of one of those of British manufacture here. No matter their economic means, amputees in early America, though, didn't have access to these specialized makers. They turned instead to a variety of craftsmen. All of them possessed basic woodworking skills and equipment, but none of them concentrated on wooden leg manufacture. And you get a sense of that from this advertisement by Boston turner Isaac Greenwood. You can see here the blue highlight. He offered wooden legs, but they appear here in a long list of items in his trade card, including T-boards, scalloped and plain salvers, lemon squeezers, and even the handles of bed warmers. So despite its functionality, a wooden leg like Morris's did not offer its wearer verisimilitude to the lost limb. In the book, I argue that instead, Morris sought to commission a Republican prosthesis. So a prosthesis far removed from both the silver legs that would have been worn by European elites, but also distinct from those unadorned, simple wooden rods padded with straw that we saw in the print of the amputee from Charity. This is a limb that would restore Morris's politeness and help him to perform as a good citizen. So to do this, Morris and his cabinet maker made a unique decision, which was to visually connect his artificial limb to high-style furniture. So if we compare Morris's leg on the right with a contemporary Philadelphia side chair on the left, we can see that his prosthesis is a pretty simplified version of that chair's cabriole leg. They both have that same tapered profile, a reduced version of the claw and ball foot's carving in the prosthesis, but I think that makes sense given how easy it would be for pieces of that carving to break off as Morris walked on it. Perhaps the most obvious relationship between Morris's leg and furniture production, though, is through the techniques and materials of upholstery. So Morris's prosthesis finished in a manner identical to seating furniture, like the Boston armchair that you see on the left. On both of these, you have a piece of leather stretched tightly across rolls of hair and grass padding before it gets tacked on to the wood with a line of brass upholstery nails. So if we come back to Morris's leg, thinking about it a little differently, thinking about it as a piece of wearable upholstered furniture, we can think about the way that it enabled Morris to camouflage his physical deformity in polite places. When Morris was seated at an elite parlor, his prosthesis became one of many stylistically similar wooden legs in the room, physically and symbolically connecting Morris to those genteel consumer goods thought to inculcate and communicate the civility that was required of all Republican citizens. For Americans who in this period were trying to figure out what the characteristics of an ideal citizen would be, prostheses then were really important. If the American Revolution had been, as George Washington claimed, a test to determine whether Americans could, quote, act like men and prove themselves worthy of the blessing of freedom, then upon the war's conclusion, Americans faced a new challenge, establishing a nation of citizens in the aftermath of the war's bodily disruptions. So wooden legs, particularly then, were critical as Americans tried to figure out how to position themselves as Republican citizens. And Morris, we'll skip that one here. Morris in his writings explicitly talked about his wooden legs in those terms of republicanism. When he was appointed ambassador to France, Morris in his diary and letters started to talk about his wooden leg as a key element of his Republican display. Morris noted gleefully in his diary that French aristocrats were unsure what to make of him. Quote, because the simplicity of my dress, my wooden leg, and tone of Republican levity seemed totally misplaced at the levee of a minister. So Morris started to embrace what he called his, quote, simple stick. Of course, we know it was anything really but a simple stick, but using that language of simplicity very much connected it to ideals of republicanism in the period. Perhaps the ultimate test of whether Morris's prosthetically enhanced body could satisfy the demands of Republican manhood came with an invitation from Morris to pose for Jean-Antoine Houdon's famous sculpture of George Washington, newly elected president, commissioned by the legislature of Virginia for the state capitol building in Richmond. And that is where the statue still stands today. Some of you may have been to see it. So Houdon had traveled to Mount Vernon, to Virginia, so that Washington could pose for him. But when it came time to make the full sculpture, he wanted an American to stand in for Washington's body. So Morris stood for Houdon at least 4 times, leading the statesman to complain that he had posed, quote, for the statue of the general till I am heartily tired. As the viewer looks at Houdon's statue of Washington then, we're seeing a bust of the president wedded to Morris's torso and lower limbs. But I would say that Morris's body did more than just stand in for Washington's. The statesman's disability also shaped Houdon's portrayal of the president because it constrained the sculptor's choice of a pose. The figure of Washington stands with his weight on his right leg, Morris's uninjured leg, while his bent left leg, Morris's amputated limb, is held slightly in front of him and it bears no weight. A classically inspired pose, it furthered Washington's connection to the Roman Republic, but it was also the only pose that Houdon's amputee model could assume. That Gouverneur Morris's body could be melded with Washington's acknowledged Morris's achievement of a civil and appropriately virile Republican manhood, despite his dismemberment. But Houdon's sculpture, as Morris well knew, was only a fiction. By removing the wooden limb that rendered Morris capable of temporarily assuming political leadership, Houdon ultimately revealed the fiction perpetuated by Morris's own prosthesis. And I want to use Morris then to return us to George Washington and where we began. Because Washington too had a physical loss and what people in the period identified as a physical handicap. Though his contemporaries applauded George Washington's body as the prime example of republicanism in statues like Houdon's, Washington, like his friend Gouverneur Morris, also required material goods to restore bodily lack. He did not lose a limb, but the president was deprived of an equally visible and important body part, his teeth. So we might think that is inconvenient, but is it really a disability? Well, in the period, people talked about tooth loss in the same moral terms that they used to talk about other forms of limb loss. They talked about it as quote unquote deformity. Contemporaries promoted the teeth as being the quote primary ornament of the mouth. They cautioned that the mere sight of the teeth is capable of giving us perfect insight into the character of a person. So George Washington then could be seen as being in a bit of a perilous moral position by having no teeth. His dentures then allowed him to perform as a civil and appropriately Republican leader. Whereas Gouverneur Morris's wooden leg was inherently public, Washington's dentures remained a carefully guarded secret. The president disguised his toothlessness by wearing replacements. He sought to limit those who knew about the fact that he wore dentures. And I just had to re-mention this portrait because in it, famously, Washington is wearing an ill-fitting pair of dentures, which made his gums swell and which resulted in this really uncomfortable-looking mouth, which both the artist and Washington were dismayed by. But Washington's dentures then, hidden inside his mouth, buried at the center of Stuart's Lansdowne portrait, themselves hid a secret, which is Washington's tooth loss. So I'd like to then return us to Washington's dressing table. We're now not going to be surprised that Washington's dentures held a secret, or I'm sorry, that Washington's dressing table held a secret, his dentures, right? We've seen women using dressing tables potentially to conceal cosmetic use. Washington's dressing table too has a pretty elaborate interior, a marble covered surface that protected the wood, a looking glass on the bottom side. And then you'll excuse this image from a blog, but it's a great example of all of the drawer space that Washington had. So like women's dressing furniture that we've been looking at, all of these compartments and lockable containers. And so potentially this allowed Washington to hide that secret of his denture use and allowed him to then maintain this public persona that we know of him as president. So I want to conclude there, just reminding us that the material choices that early Americans made were really fundamentally important for making them into the Americans who they wanted very much to be. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Van Horn, for a wonderful presentation. And I'd just like to remind the audience that if they have a question, we'd ask them to use the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. We have about 10 minutes, so we should be able to get to a couple. Emily wrote, did 18th century cosmetics contain dangerous substances like lead? Were there health complications for women and men who regularly wore cosmetics?
That is a great question. And so there's some wonderful folks out there who have come at that question with chemical analysis. So I am not a chemist, and I'm only marginally passable in scientific knowledge. I feel like my scientific knowledge kind of ends around 1800, which is probably dangerous. But definitely, yes. So women oftentimes, it's lead white, right, with painters are using in the period as well, but it oftentimes gets added to women's things like white pomade that would have given a white color. It's also used in treatments for burns in the 18th century, lead, because it also was supposed to take away the sensation of burning. People in the period were quite aware that some things like lead, additives, arsenic had a really dangerous impact on women. So you start seeing doctors as early as the 1760s or 70s writing into journals, instructing women not to overdo it with their cosmetic use, to recognize that they could really hurt themselves. There's some famous examples of young, beautiful women who in fact kill themselves with this over cosmetic use. So certainly that's something that people are also thinking and talking about in the period. That's a great question. Thank you so much.
So there was a question from Catherine who said, can you please address the issue of race in skin theory you discuss? You mentioned Jefferson in the notes on the state of Virginia. Was his attitude towards dark-skinned people widespread?
So that's a wonderful point. Yeah, that is the rest of that quote. You're exactly right. Jefferson goes on to talk about the kind of what he sees as a veil of blackness that keeps people who have darker colored skin from registering the same emotions that you see white skin being able to register through those permutations of blushing or not blushing. So this is certainly tied in the 18th century to ideas about the humors and how the body works. And those are also, as you're noting, connected to ideas, very racist ideas about sort of inherent capabilities of different peoples, right? And so this idea as well in this period promoted by some that skin tone could be changed by climate, right? So this notion that race is not necessarily fixed, but that darker skin comes from the result of sun exposure, but also from what people identified in the period. And by people, I should really specify, white, British, European, or American natural historians identified as being morally lax behavior. So these very racist notions then, in which dark skin color was both physical proof of a kind of lack of good morality.
We may be having some minor technical issues here. It seems that Professor Van Horn's connection might not be stable. Hi,
Gavin. Hi, everybody. This, if you can believe this, it just rarely happens. So why don't we give her just a moment? I am going to attribute this to the terrible winds that we're having, but let's see if we can get her back, because we do have a few minutes.
right.
I was really struck, though, in this presentation by sort of exactly what we talked about, the power of objects, the kind of deep read. I feel like I learned an incredible amount.
Yeah, I mean, the prosthetic leg, the sort of interpretation of it as, looking at it as a piece of furniture, there was a language going on there that I would not have seen if she had not been pointing it out. It was
right. It is a language. It's a vocabulary of analysis. And it's so interesting, too, when we think about material culture. For a long time, historians were very distracted by pieces of the past that they assumed were normal, but they were really elite. So like little suits of armor would survive. And people thought, oh, those people were so short. Well, the truth is it was made for a child. And of course it lasted because it was such an odd item. And the idea of the prosthetic leg, there must have been a ton of them. There must have been, because people men especially lost legs all the time. But we have just this one left is sort of striking.
Sort of interpreting from very limited amount of evidence.
Yes.
Sort of go to show how material culture and the study of material culture is such a tricky process, where you're trying to understand a whole narrative based on just a vanishingly small number of fragments, and fragments which can't actually speak to you there. They don't have their own voice. Yes. They're not written.
But certainly with clothing too, and we just had it actually under Dennis, we had a fashion exhibition. So deceptive, because that clothing and those materials get passed down and then they get altered. And when I was working on Dolly Madison, I saw one of her dresses, and I was like, when I saw it, I was like, no way. It was very small and very low cut, and Dolly Madison was a very full-bodied lady, let us just say. And so I absolutely doubted the provenance. But of course, it was one of her dresses, but it had been cut down probably 3 or 4 times. So by the time we sort of got to see it, it was from the early 1900s, and it had completely been transformed. So even things that we know were somebody's, especially if they were clothing, they were just altered, and it's kind of thriftiness that we have to kind of adjust our minds around.
Yeah, when we had the fashion show, some of the talks that we had talked about how these dresses were reconfigured multiple times. And so what you saw, it may be, a 18th century dress, but it's an 18th century dress that's been reinterpreted under multiple styles. Aha!
Yes.
I believe, Professor.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you? We've just been marveling about your work and how much we learned tonight. We probably have time for a couple more questions, so I'll bow out really quickly.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The power just...
Yeah, I think that it must be the high winds. So.
Ah, man, that was exciting. Sorry.
So let's see. So we probably don't have time for too many questions, but let me see if we can find a good one. So Anne wrote, what are your sources for your description of the use of cosmetics to either emotionally read facial expressions or dissemble? I'm not questioning your assertion. I'm wondering how we know these things: diaries, novels of the era, letters, etc.
Oh, great question. Yeah, it's that process of writing a book, right? That things winnow down to where you're making statements, but you're not always giving that full flavor of what you've consulted. So absolutely, plays of the period. This is this major trope, right, of women being kind of counterfeited coins because they're wearing cosmetics. Certainly, things like The Spectator, right? These kind of popular periodicals use this as a kind of constant joke. But we also see this, things like Benjamin Franklin, right? Franklin writes to women in Poor Richard's Almanac and says, you all know that men really prefer women who are plain if they don't use cosmetics, right? And as soon as you use cosmetics, people assume that you're living a lie. So women are hearing that from all sorts of sources. And we also saw those satirical prints, right? And those are a really rich, I think, source, both indicative of a really large strand of misogyny, but also getting at that idea of cosmetics and deception. So that's something that I feel pretty confident we're seeing on all sorts of levels of cultural production.
Great. So I think we have maybe time for one last question. Andrea wrote, I'm curious about whether the need for eyeglasses was also considered a deformity. There is, of course, the famous story of how Washington used his spectacles to great effect during the first Newburgh Address.
Oh, that's such a wonderful incident. And thank you so much for bringing that up. I always think about that. It's this incident where Washington, there's another description of Washington and his spectacles, and he's got too many things in his hands. He's got both his spectacles and he's carrying his speech, and he can't quite negotiate which one he's supposed to hold. And somebody writes about it in the period as just being this remarkable moment where Washington seems a little bit kind of not as put together as he always was as Washington. And so the spectacles strike me as a similar instance where kind of the crack of humanity gets revealed, and people love Washington all the more for it. I would have to think more about that. That's a wonderful question. I know there's a really fascinating book, which it's on my bookshelf back there, but have I read it? No. About spectacles in early America. So I know folks out there are working on it. My suspicion is that it's a little bit more widely acceptable. Though I would be interested to think about the ways that it may or may not indicate social status. So one of the things about dentures, right, is like they're so expensive that only this very small strata of people are able to afford them. And I don't know enough about spectacles. I suspect it's a wider swath of people, but I don't know how much wider of a swath who's able to afford those as a technology to deal with a disability. But that's a wonderful question and a great comparison. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And sorry about the technical difficulties. I think that just to be conscious of people's time and their dinners that may be waiting, we should wrap up. So I just would like to, again, thank you. And I would also be happy to point out for them to buy a copy of The Power of Objects in 18th Century. It is available, and just right now, it is on sale through the UNC Press. So if you follow the link, uncpress.org/holiday sale, you can get 40% off. So it's a great deal. We also, of course, will point out that MHS provides all of these programs for free, but we're able to do that thanks to the support of our members and donors, and we hope that people will join us and consider supporting us.
And I just want to say again, thank you, Dr. Van Horn. And Dennis, I know you're out there, and I hope you think we did you proud. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.